Hello, welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome back to the program Ty Bordner, who's Senior VP of Marketing and Business Development at Amber Road. And today we're going to talk about from purchase order to last customs mile, streamlining and automating the global supply chain. So you've got words like risk, complexity, uncertainty, dynamic. I mean, these are all terms that are used to describe the global supply chain, and they're certainly truer today than ever before. So then the question is, how can companies successfully navigate, through this environment? What actions can they take to streamline and automate the global trade processes, and how can technology help? Well, those are the main questions we're going to discuss in today's episode, and it's great to have Ty, back in the program to share his insights and perspective and advice on this topic. So Ty, welcome back.
Thanks, Adrian. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
So Ty, like I just said, it seems like global supply chain management becomes riskier and more complex, every year. And, even as we speak here, for example, there's still a lot of uncertainty with regards to, Brexit and what may or may not happen in the days and weeks ahead. And, there's still a lot of uncertainty around, the U.S. and China relations and what's happening there. I mean, overall, what kind of challenges are these trends creating for companies?
Well, I think, it's been a crazy year or a couple of years with all these changes. You mentioned a couple of them, Brexit, and, then you've also got the tariffs and, you got USMCA, which is another big sort of still unknown. We don't quite know when, if 100% or when that'll get ratified. But there's like other things too, like, people talk about the China tariffs, but what people don't realize, because it's not in the news, it's not in the headlines, is China is revamping all of their regulations, right? China is adding export regulations to basically sort of, I would say, come up to speed with the rest of the sort of Wassenaar countries. And, that doesn't get headlines. Nobody knows that. But, if you're a multinational company and you got factories and plants in China and you're going to export your goods back out of there, well, you're going to have to deal with these things. So, but to your point, all of these things, all of these changes, the unknowns, I think what people look at it is, well, I need to be agile and nimble. I need to have the ability to react whichever fork in the road, the stuff takes, right? Tariffs, are there, then tariffs may go away, and, who knows what's going to happen. So how do I plan for that? How do I execute against that? I got to have, really, I think it does call out for technology. The only way to effectively do this is to have a system that can be, the digital twin of the real world. And that digital twin is going to take, again, whichever fork in the road, happens. And you got to be able to react. So I think that's the key. That uncertainty, and the ability to react to it is what people are looking for.
Yeah, great point. And that point about China kind of, ties into my next question. I mean, you read, about import and export statistics in trade publications, whether it's, the trade deficit, or you read about how many imports came in through Long Beach and so forth. But unless you're in the front lines, managing import and export transactions, you really don't realize how much data is involved and how much, some of these new regulations or existing regulations, what's involved in truly being in compliance with them and gathering all the information that's required and so forth to really make this whole engine, work. When you look across, companies and particularly your customers and so forth, I mean, what separates the leaders from the laggards and how they gather and process data, the data required to execute import and export transactions?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say that you are absolutely right, that people do not realize, unless you're in the trenches, do not realize what it is and what it takes to satisfy the requirements of moving goods across borders, right? So, you start with that PO and executing the PO to a place halfway around the world that speaks a different language and all the amendments that occur against the PO and how do you manage that? And then you're gonna want to connect the shipments that come together against that PO. They're gonna move. You got to book them. You want to track them. You want to understand where things are and where things aren't. And again, you want to connect this back to your PO. You want to understand from a supply chain practitioner's perspective, all of these things. And the complexity starts to build. You're talking about vendor bookings and factory shipments and consolidation centers and bringing these things together on a bill of lading and a master bill and a house bill. And You've got export documentation and licenses you might have to deal with the government, the exporting government. And then again, you got to book those things. You want to make an efficient booking. You want to do things, to meet your company's goals, whether it be speed and time in transit or cost. And then you've got to clear the goods on the import side, right? So now you've got to get all that product data together, all of the information together. And, a lot of this today is manual. People are not digitizing this part of the supply chain. So again, I'll go back to your question. It's a broad spectrum. I think people in the trenches certainly have to understand it and do this, but they may be in silos. This may not be one group inside a company that deals with everything. It could be, the sourcing team or the logistics team, or maybe called supply chain. And maybe there's a trade compliance group or division that's supporting some of this activity. So, it's difficult. It's difficult. And then if you go up the chain to the C-suite, I mean, they often they just don't know. Now, maybe in the last year or two, some of this stuff is getting a little bit more visibility because of what's going on with some of the things we talked about earlier. So, some of that visibility could be happening. I think we see that within Amber Road, that people are starting to recognize, hey, how do I deal with these things? And is there a better way to do it? As companies, it really depends on, a lot depends on the company's volumes. I mean, if you've got a sort of a high volume business where you're moving a lot of transactions, orders, shipments, et cetera, customs entries, then you may want to gather the data and put it into a digital platform to be able to execute, because the more transactions you have and the more that you can automate, the more payback you're going to have. If you've got low volumes, you may not look to automate as much because there is a cost to automate some of this stuff. But you may still want to have a system that captures the data digitally so that you can analyze it and also maybe communicate it and send it to and from your partners, like your brokers, your carriers, your forwarders. So it's a spectrum, and it's, there isn't necessarily one solution fits all companies, but there's a lot of opportunity out there to be able to take what people are doing on paper today and digitize that. And there's just so much value there in terms of cost savings, back to agility, being agile and flexible, and also reducing risk, right? Risk in the supply chain, not just compliance risk, but risk in, being able to ride over things that happen to you, so you can execute and still move your goods as you need to.
Right. So I find the same thing. I mean, I think, at the one end of the spectrum is people are doing this completely manual, right? So they're just throwing labor at this, and it's just very, costly and inefficient. And it's hard to be agile when everything has to be typed in and everything's in, paper-based and so forth. But even those that are digitized, to your point, I mean, a lot of this data resides in many different systems and across many different, trading partners, perhaps. So part of the next step would be, obviously digitizing, but then the next step is, bringing all this together to have that one, version of the truth, if you will, or a way to kind of facilitate, the bringing of all this data from different sources, even once it's digital, right? So part of digital is getting it digitized is one thing, but then being able to aggregate it in a quick and efficient and in a normalized way, being able to link a purchase order to a bill of lading to an entry form, that's part of the secret sauce, right? That I would think that the leaders are kind of there, if you will, or working towards that.
Yeah, you're right on. I like to classify it into three major sort of life cycle phases, okay? And the majority of folks today are in phase one. And phase one is I hire experts, I hire customs brokers and freight forwarders to do this work for me. And I try to give them as much info as I can, but what's going to happen is they're going to need information to clear customs, whether it be on the export or on the import side. Largely, the import's a lot larger in that respect in terms of complexity. And they're going to call me up and ask me questions when they need to ask me questions, typically when the goods are there at the port clearing. Hey, I need information about this to know what the harmonized number is of this because I don't have it, in my system. So can you help me? And that takes time and could take days, and, customs holds up the goods movement. So, but that's phase one, sort of. And again, I'll just reiterate, that's where it is today. That's the majority of what's happening today. Phase two is digitizing data. So getting all the attributes about your product records that are going to be needed for cross-border movement. not just one country, but for all the countries these goods are going to move across, right? So having that digitized, perhaps then sharing that digital information with my partners, with the brokers and the forwarders, so that I can start to leverage that capability. And I'm still not at the point where I'm automating the creation of the transaction, which is what I'll get to in phase 3. But I'm starting to gain some efficiencies here. I don't have to redo things over and over. If I'm bringing a good in every week, right, and the broker asks me the same questions every week for that good, well, there's value lost, right? There's extra redundant work. So I want to reduce that. And then phase 3, which is where everybody's going and everybody's trying to get to, and it's obviously not a simple thing, but this is what certainly what Amber Road is doing, is automating the buildup of that transaction. So being able to take that digital representation of product data, the digital representation of partner data, your partners that you're going to need information, which includes your suppliers, and then having the transactional records, which are coming into the system digitally. So that could be things like a purchase order, could be a sales order, could be a bill of lading, a packing list, a commercial invoice, an ASN. So these transactions exist out there in the world in some digital form. So those transactions come into the system, and the system is smart enough to know how to then pull in the master data to build out the completed cross-border transaction, right? And that's phase 3, and that is where the value lies, right? That is where we, just start to start, how many transactions are you dealing with? And if it takes me X amount of people and X amount of communication and forwarder time and broker time, and you're paying all these folks a lot of money to do this, and now you can have a software system that does the bulk of that work, maybe not everything, but the bulk of that work, you can start to understand that you can reap huge benefits. The last leg of a journey is, start to coin this term, the last customs mile. So you can build up all this transactional data and you can hand it off to your broker or forwarder, and there's great value in that. But you can also have the capability to take it the next step. So go ahead and directly file that transaction with customs. Again, whether it be an export or an import, whatever country you're doing business in. So now you're taking that complete digital journey of the transaction, let's say from PO all the way to customs entry, and automating the process and including that tough little step. I say little because honestly, a lot of it is not as large as all the other work to build up the transaction, but to be able to take that, hand it off to customs digitally, and then there's just another level of value that's just risen up and created. Does that make sense? Yeah, no,
you touched upon what was going to be my next question. I mean, you talked about the last customs mile. I mean, you hear a lot about last mile in the retail sector, right? As it relates to, home delivery and everything else. But, as you just talked about, there is this last mile, component with regards to customs compliance too. And you can describe it a little bit there. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit more about that? And, what's involved, and, are companies doing this today, or are they relying on third parties to do this last mile for them? And is technology helping them perhaps do this on their own now? How's that working?
It's interesting. I want to say it's 2001 or 2. I'm not sure of the exact year, but U.S. Customs came up with a new regulation. It was called remote location filing. So prior to that, you needed to be in the port of where you're bringing goods in to file it. In other words, you could not be on a computer somewhere in San Diego and you're filing in, you're filing in Baltimore, right? Wasn't allowed. But remote location filing said, okay, you don't need to be at the port to file. You can be wherever, right? It's the internet age was here, or, back then. And certainly a lot of people thought, U.S. Customs thought that would create this opportunity for not only brokers to become more efficient, to be able to do, centers of excellences within their organizations, to be able to help their own customers file these things throughout the country, but thought that, companies would say, well, I can do this myself. I'm going to go ahead and create, you're going to need technology to do it in some way, shape, or form. The reality was, back then, what those companies would have had to do was take what their customs brokers were doing for them and essentially take those people and hire those people effectively. and you know, maybe they couldn't do it as well as the customs broker who does it for an absolute living, right? And so taking people that are keying in data off commercial invoices, you know, they're looking at their commercial invoice up on a template and typing the data in and doing all that. Bringing that in-house was not that appealing, right? And technology today, software companies have evolved, as I mentioned earlier, from an automation standpoint, where it is now possible that you don't need to have those people to do all that work. In other words, the software can do that work. So, and this is just happening, right? I mean, even within Amber Road, we're just, like I said, we spent many years building up the transaction, and we're just now having the ability to file the transaction to that last customs mile. So we think it's a game changer. We think this is a game changer for the industry. People have been looking at becoming self-filers for a long time. They haven't really done it. I think the percentage in the US is like 5% of companies self-file. But we think the capability of the automation, not just having to rekey the data in, and the connection to the custom system is a game changer, and people can now take advantage of that and create a lot of value. They may not want to do it. They may still want to leverage their brokers and forwarders to do the filing, and building up that transaction in an automated way and handing it off is still valuable. Now in Europe, it's a lot more prevalent. I'm not exactly 100% sure why. I don't know that anybody knows why, but in Europe, the amount of self-filers that exist are, you know, maybe 30 to 40% of companies are self-filing today. So, you know, it's interesting. Again, I'm not exactly sure why, but that is a difference between, let's say, the US and Europe, and then the rest of the world is largely, you know, using brokers and forwarders to file.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you know, that would be an interesting research question to understand why that is more prevalent in Europe. But I think I agree. You know, I think you know, with your point, you know, being that historically, you know, a lot of importers, for example, that, you know, they would look at this and say, you know, it makes no sense for us to bring it in house because it's just, you know, it's just a very, very labor intensive you know, process. We don't have the internal expertise to do it, and so forth. But now, you know, with you know, the technology capabilities that are available today and everything we just talked about, you know, it becomes, you know, an option, you know, that might be worthwhile, you know, considering. I want to circle back, kind of changing gears a little bit now, you know, talking about the tariffs and you know, when I talk to a lot of companies with new tariffs being imposed by, you know, US and China and others, a lot of companies are looking at, you know, how, you know, to best navigate them. And, you know, one of the things, it's not necessarily new, but I mean, I think many companies perhaps haven't explored it in the past, is to take advantage of, you know, duty, you know, deferral, you know, regimes, whether it's, you know, here in the US, foreign trade zones, or, you know, customs warehousing in Europe. I mean, what's required ultimately to implement and manage, you know, duty referral, you know, particularly from a technology standpoint?
Yeah, well, let me first start by explaining it a little bit for the viewers so they understand. So what duty deferral means is governments all around the world create a set of regulations that allow you to bring goods into the country in a temporary zone, if you will, so that you didn't pay duties on them yet. And you may keep them there for, you know, certain different periods of time, depending on the country and the regulation. And you've deferred that duty, and maybe only bring them out of that zone when you're ready to sell them and gain revenue, right? So, you know, from a cash flow perspective and the sort of time value of money, you know, you can see the advantage there. And there are multiple different regimes, if you will. Regimes meaning regulations. You know, there's just bringing in a good and housing it there, and then you know, just pulling that good out and selling it. There's also manufacturing. So China is well known for this. There's a famous regime in China called processing trade, and it's, you know, it's what it sounds like. It allows people to bring in raw materials into China, leverage the low-cost labor, which isn't as low-cost as it used to be, but it's changing. Leverage that low-cost labor, build a product, and then send it back to Europe or the United States, right? But you've never actually paid duty on that raw material, right? You bring it into a zone, you build it, you send it out, you never paid duty. So again, there's different types. There's the sort of just bring it in, take it out, and then there's manufacturing, where you're bringing in raw materials, building something. And what's happened is, and what you need to do, you need to prove to the government, to customs, that you accounted for everything. So essentially what duty deferral means, it's a virtual accounting system. You just have to have a record that says, here's what I brought in, here's what I took out, here's, I paid duties if I brought it into the country, I didn't pay duties if I took it, back out. I got to account for scrap. I got to, you got to account for all these things. Like I said, it's a virtual accounting system, and there's all sorts of complex rules around different countries' ways to do it. The U.S. has the foreign trade zone regime, which has got a whole subset of different regulations depending on what you're doing. Europe has, a customs warehouse, they call it, EU customs warehouse, and each country within there has different rules and things. And so it's very complex rules, and having a software system is kind of the only real way to go. I mean, certainly if you have any volume. If you got minimal volume, you can probably do it on a spreadsheet, but if you got any kind of volume at all, tracking all these things, and then the next step is really tying that software that's managing the inputs and the outputs of what's coming in and out. It's like a warehouse, but it's a virtual warehouse, tying that to the filing. So then being able to take those records and file them right to customs when you're gonna actually do the real import now. You got to file the record when you brought it into the zone too. It's not a real import, but customs wants to know about it. So all of this stuff tied together in one system, there's a great advantage to that, we think anyway, in doing it the right way. And you don't have disparate systems and different people and different systems doing it. You've got sort of one system that's handling all that capability. And what I think's happening is one of the reasons why this is getting more airtime is because of these tariffs. People are now like, oh my God, my stuff's going to 10% or 25% tariff. Now the value of being able to defer those duties, because the numbers got bigger. Now that monetary value just got bigger. So people are starting to look at schemes and ways, legal schemes, not in a bad way, be able to take advantage of the, I always use the golf analogy. The golf rule book is there for you to help you, right? If you know the rules, you can take advantage of the rules, and these rules are there to help you. If you know the rules and take advantage of them, you can increase your margins and lower your duty burden.
Yeah, I think this is another great example of kind of the complexity, involved in all this. I mean, as you mentioned, the way the U.S. manages this is different than China. It's different than the EU, and then every country in the EU has different, rules specific to how they do it. So, being able to, codify, if you will, in the software, these different, requirements by country and by program, so you're able to be in compliance with it. I mean, I love the analogy of a kind of an accounting system, because that's really, what it is. It's in many ways, it's really being able to keep track of all that. And then ultimately, many of these things ultimately turn into an export or an import. So being able to tie that data, going back to our point before, in terms of the importance of bringing in all these pieces of data, then being able to automate, automate the end-to-end process. If you are leveraging these programs, being able to then take, the data, the information that comes out of these duty deferral programs, and then feed them into the import or the export process. I can see how that helps to keeps the wheel of global trade management friction free, if you will. So Ty, we're running short on time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. I mean, for companies that are looking to move up the maturity curve with regards to global trade management capabilities, I mean, what attributes or capabilities should they look for and have in place, and particularly from a technology platform as well? Yeah,
well, I think in the coming from the software background, which I come from, I know you come from an engineering background as well. It all starts with requirements, right? You got to understand what your business goals are. What do you want to accomplish? What are you trying to achieve? Now you can go out and talk to technology vendors and understand what they have, so that can influence your goals, if you will, but really ultimately you got to get that right. If you do not get the requirements right, you can't be successful, right? So I would tell anybody, first of all, understand, and some of the things that maybe that you need to do is, when you get those requirements and you have an idea about what you want, and again, you can explore vendors to see what they might be able to do, and that could change your deal, but you got to build an ROI, right? So there's a lot of things that you need to do from a compliance standpoint, sure, but nobody's going to go, up to the budget committee and ask for a whole bunch of money unless they can prove that it will provide a return. And there is tremendous amount of ability to get return here, right? This isn't just to solve a compliance problem. This is actual value in margin creation, cost reduction, agility, risk, all that rolled into one. But you got to define it. So I would recommend anybody figure out what your requirements are, define your ROI, and then you can say, now, I need budget to go do something. And, some of the things to just, I think, be wary of or watch out for in this area is, you don't necessarily want to go out and do phase one and have a vendor that solves phase one, and then you go for phase two, and now that vendor doesn't have phase two. You got to go get a second vendor. And then you want to do phase three, and now you got to get a third vendor, right? So I think one thing you should do is look at your holistic view. So not just what you want to do in the next year or so, but look out and say, what's my 5-year roadmap? Where do I want to be and what's possible? And then the second thing I'd say that people should watch out for, some of the gotchas is, within this area, within this global supply chain execution space and trade compliance and importing and exporting and supply chain visibility, there's a lot of content. There's these rules and regulations, as we've referenced here. So look to see if your vendor, are you going to have to go to multiple vendors to solve the problem, or you're going to be able to go to a one-stop shop? Also, some vendors, they have a software vendor, but they don't do the implementation. So then you'll have to go to a third party to do implementation, right? So you got to just evaluate that and make sure that you understand that if you want to have one vendor that provides things like the software, the content, the hosting, the implementation. If you don't, if you want to have multiple vendors to do that, that's fine. But just be aware of that as you're going through an evaluation process is what I would recommend for folks.
Yeah, no, great advice. Starting with, defining your objectives or your goals and where you want to get to. I think that's always the smartest, and that ultimately is going to dictate whether you're going to be moving down a path to success or one that's going to be fraught with all sorts of, challenges. And defining the ROI, I think in this global trade space, a lot of times, folks might think of it as just like a risk avoidance, compliance, avoiding, compliance penalties and things like that. But when you really look at the broader picture, it's so much more than that. And we just talked about even just labor savings. You might be throwing an army of people just to, and then, when you do have a lot of people typing in stuff, that introduces data inaccuracies that then can hold up shipments and creates more, creates some stockouts, and the list goes on, right? So I think, looking at that broader ROI picture, I think is important. And finally, thinking not just of the near term, but also the long-term requirements and where you want to head to, I think is important as well. Well, Ty, we, particularly in this topic with global trade, we could probably spend hours talking about everything that's going on here, but I think we hit some of the highlights. You provided some great food for thought and advice for our listeners. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us today. Hey,
thanks a lot, Adrian. It's always nice to chat. I appreciate it.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Amber Road website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Ty, you can post it there. I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.